You could already sense something was changing before you ever had the words for it. That subtle shift, that growing distance, like someone slowly turning down the brightness in a room that once felt warm and alive. And now you're here questioning yourself, wondering if you're overthinking, wondering if you're being too sensitive. Maybe he just needs space. Maybe he's dealing with something. Maybe if you wait long enough, he'll return to how he was in the beginning, when everything felt easy and you felt chosen. But what most people don't understand is this. With an avoidant, the leaving rarely looks like a clear ending. It doesn't look like a door being shut. It looks more like a window slowly clouding over until one day you press your hand against it and realize you can't see through anymore. And you can't even pinpoint when it changed. So before you talk yourself into ignoring what you're feeling, before you send another message you'll overthink later, before you keep giving pieces of yourself to someone who may have already checked out emotionally, there are things you need to understand. Because there are signs here, and they don't lie. Once you learn to recognize them, you won't be able to unsee them. And avoidant attachment rarely shows up in the obvious ways people expect. It isn't always distant from the start. It isn't always cold or detached. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's the person who came in strongly at first, who made you feel safe, seen, and finally met in a way you hadn't experienced before. The one who felt present, engaged, emotionally open. And then, slowly, something shifts. The messages get shorter, the effort changes. He stops initiating the way he used to. Conversations that once lasted for hours now end quickly, almost abruptly, and you start explaining it away. He's busy, he's stressed, he's distracted. And without realizing it, you start adjusting yourself. You ask for less, you express less, you take up less space so you don't overwhelm him, because loving someone who pulls away teaches you to shrink. But the hard truth is this: shrinking never fixes the distance. At the core, avoidant attachment is often rooted in early emotional conditioning, learning that closeness doesn't feel safe, that depending on others leads to disappointment, that vulnerability carries risk. So walls get built, not out of cruelty, but out of protection. Because emotional closeness can feel internally like losing control or losing yourself. And for a while, you might feel like the exception, especially in the beginning. There's often a phase where everything feels open and connected, where the avoidant seems fully present. But as soon as real intimacy starts forming, when things become emotionally real and expectations deepen, that same system starts to react. Distance increases. Pulling away begins. What you experienced early on wasn't necessarily fake, but it also wasn't fully sustainable for them. It came from a space where connection hadn't yet triggered their deeper fear responses. And when it does, their instinct is to create space again. The real question becomes whether they work through that discomfort with you, or whether they quietly decide it's easier to step away. Because there's a difference between someone who is struggling with closeness but still emotionally invested, and someone who has already emotionally exited but hasn't made it clear yet. And the second one is the one that confuses you the most, because on the surface, it still looks like distance, still looks like avoidance. So you wait, you adjust, you try harder for both people, while they're already halfway gone internally. There are signs that separate those two states. The first is the disappearance of repair. Every relationship has moments of friction, misunderstandings, emotional bumps. That's normal. What matters is not avoiding conflict, but what happens after it. Do both people come back toward each other? Do they try to reconnect, to clear the tension, to rebuild the bridge? Even avoidants who are still invested will show some version of repair. It might not be direct, it might not be immediate, but there is usually movement back toward connection in some form. A message, a gesture, a light attempt to reset the tone, something that says, even indirectly, we're okay. But when someone has emotionally checked out, that movement stops. After tension, there's just silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from needing space and then returning, but a lingering absence where nothing gets addressed. No repair, no reconnection. And over time, it becomes a pattern. You're the one restarting things. You're the one closing every gap. And if you don't, nothing happens at all. And that's the difference you start to notice if you look back honestly. Who has been doing the returning, the reaching, the repairing, the restarting? If every time you ask yourself that question, the answer is always you, that's not something you can keep brushing off. Because in the early stage, it probably wasn't like that. He likely did reach out first sometimes. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if it wasn't consistent, there was at least some effort to move toward you, some signal, some initiation, something that said, I'm here too. And now that's gone. And what often happens is you don't notice the shift right away because you've been so focused on holding things together. You've been the one keeping the connection alive, the one checking in, the one bridging silence, the one making sure things don't fully fall apart. So you don't realize that slowly, without a clear moment of awareness, you've become the only one doing it. The absence of repair isn't just about who sends the first message. It's about who still feels the need to restore connection after distance or tension. It's about who still cares whether things feel okay between you. And when someone has emotionally disengaged, that concern starts to disappear. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, through inaction. Now, the second sign is where things get even more confusing, because on the surface, it can actually look positive. It can even look like growth. It's what I would call strategic replacement. This is what happens when an avoidant is no longer emotionally invested in the relationship, but also doesn't sit with the emotional weight of ending it. Instead of processing loss directly, they unconsciously start filling the space the relationship used to occupy. And from the outside, it can look like they're thriving. Suddenly, there are new interests, new routines, new people, more time spent outside, more activity, more movement. Their world expands, but noticeably in directions that don't include you. They seem busy, distracted, engaged with life in a way that might almost convince you things are improving. And if you're not careful, you might even feel relieved at first. Like maybe this is healthy distance. Maybe this is them becoming more independent. But there's a different kind of pattern underneath that, because this isn't balanced expansion. It's replacement. It's the mind and body avoiding emotional confrontation by redirecting energy somewhere else, anywhere else. And what makes it painful is the emotional contrast. You're sitting in uncertainty, trying to understand where you stand, trying to interpret silence, trying to keep something stable that feels like it's slipping. Meanwhile, they appear to be moving forward without the same emotional weight. That gap between your internal experience and their external presentation is information. It tells you something important about emotional investment. When someone is still connected, even if they're pulling back, there's usually still some trace of emotional tension, something unresolved that lingers in the background. You can often feel it, even in distance. There's a subtle inconsistency in their presence, like part of them is still engaged in what's not working. But when someone has emotionally detached, that tension fades. What replaces it is not sadness or reflection, but relief. And that relief often shows up as momentum, activity, filling space, moving on without naming it. So pay attention to direction, not just whether they're busy, but where their energy is going over time. If it consistently moves away from shared connection and deeper involvement with you, and toward entirely separate parts of life, that pattern matters more than any single interaction. And also notice what happens when you are together. Because sometimes they're physically present, but emotionally absent. They might sit next to you, talk to you, even respond normally on the surface, but something feels off. Like you're not fully reaching them anymore. Like there's a layer between you that wasn't there before. That feeling of someone being there but not really being there is often more revealing than silence itself, because it shows you that the separation isn't just about distance in communication, it's internal. You're no longer accessing the same emotional place in them that you once did, and over time, that creates a very specific kind of pain. Not a clear ending, not a clear rejection, but a slow experience of replacement where the person you knew seems less and less reachable, even when they're right in front of you. Now, the third sign is the one people almost always misunderstand, because it doesn't look like withdrawal at first. It can actually look like patience, like giving space, like maturity, like you're just respecting their emotional pace. But underneath it, something much more significant is happening. It's the loss of curiosity. Think back to how it started, when he was engaged with you, not just present, but genuinely interested, asking things that went beyond surface level, wanting to understand how you think, what shaped you, what you felt about things that mattered, what your inner world looked like when no one else was around. That kind of curiosity creates connection, because it's not just attention, it's investment. It says, I see you as someone worth understanding. And at the beginning, that curiosity is often strong. It feels like being noticed in a way you hadn't experienced before. But now, look at what's changed. When was the last time he asked you something that showed real emotional interest in you? Not logistics, not routine conversation, but something that revealed he was still mentally reaching toward who you are internally. Because when curiosity fades, something important goes with it. It means the effort to understand you is no longer active. And when that effort disappears, emotional engagement usually isn't far behind. At that point, communication can still happen. Interaction can still exist, but it becomes flatter, more functional, less exploratory, less alive. And that shift is often subtle enough that you explain it away. You assume he's just distracted, or tired, or in his head, or going through a phase. But sustained loss of curiosity is not just a phase. It reflects a deeper change in emotional orientation. Because when someone is still connected, they naturally want to know you more, not less. Even in small ways, even inconsistently. So when that disappears, and it's been gone for a while, what you're often seeing is not distance alone, it's disinvestment. A question that made you feel like you were still someone worth exploring in his mind. Like there was still something about you he was paying attention to, still something he wanted to understand. And if you're sitting there trying to recall the last time that happened, that in itself says a lot. Because real connection doesn't lose curiosity completely. Not in the beginning, not in the middle, not even when things get difficult. Real emotional investment keeps a kind of ongoing interest alive. Not obsessive or intense, but steady. A natural pull toward wanting to know more about the other person, even after you already know them. With an avoidant who is still emotionally present, curiosity doesn't disappear just because they're pulling back. Even if they struggle with expression, even if they withdraw under stress, there are still signs of engagement underneath it. They remember things you said and bring them up later. They circle back to topics you mentioned in passing. They ask follow-up questions. They show that, even at a distance, you are still mentally present for them. Those details matter more than they seem, because they show that you still exist in their inner world in an active way. But when someone has emotionally checked out, that changes. Not suddenly, not loudly, but gradually. The questions stop going deeper. Conversations flatten. Interaction becomes functional, practical, predictable. It's no longer about discovering you. It's about managing communication. And that shift creates a very specific kind of loneliness. Because you're still technically together, still interacting, still in contact. But something essential is missing. You stop feeling seen. You stop feeling mentally reached. You can share something meaningful, something vulnerable, something real, and it lands nowhere. It gets a surface response, a quick acknowledgement, a reply that doesn't actually meet you where you are. And over time, that starts to affect how you see yourself. You begin questioning your own depth, your own value, your own ability to hold someone's attention. So you adjust. You try to be more engaging, more interesting. You try to create moments that might bring him back into connection, because the natural ones aren't happening anymore. But the issue was never your ability to hold interest. It was his willingness to stay interested. And the loss of curiosity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a clear moment you can point to. It just fades, slowly, until one day you realize the relationship feels like it's happening on the surface only. So when you bring all three signs together, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The disappearance of repair, where every attempt to reconnect after distance or conflict comes from you, not him, where silence stretches without him making any effort to close the gap. Strategic replacement, where his energy steadily shifts into new spaces, new people, new routines. Places where you are no longer naturally included, not because of a conversation, but because of a directional change in his life. And the death of curiosity, where conversations lose depth, emotional interest fades, and you stop feeling mentally or emotionally met in any real way. When these three patterns are consistently present, not as occasional moments, but as the new normal, what you're dealing with is no longer uncertainty about where things stand. It's clarity that the emotional position he once held in the relationship is no longer active. And this is where people often get caught in a painful cycle. Because once you start sensing this shift, the instinct is usually to do more, to try harder, to re-engage, to become more understanding, more patient, more available, to compensate for the distance by increasing your own effort. It feels logical emotionally. If someone is pulling away, the natural response is to reach closer, to close the gap, to hold on tighter to what feels like it's slipping. But that's where things start to turn. With an avoidant who has already emotionally checked out, what usually happens is not reconnection, it's acceleration of distance. Because at the core of avoidant wiring is a deep sensitivity to feeling trapped, overwhelmed, or emotionally cornered. So when they sense that someone is leaning in harder while they are pulling back, their system doesn't interpret that as love. It reads it as pressure. And pressure doesn't bring them closer. It pushes them further away. The withdrawal deepens, the emotional walls go higher, the warmth disappears more completely, and suddenly you find yourself in a loop where the more effort you put in, the less access you seem to have to them. And that's where a painful story often forms, that if you had been enough, they would have stayed, that if you had loved differently or tried harder, things would have changed. But that story misses the truth of what's actually happening. You weren't failing to reach someone who was available to be reached. You were trying to create connection with someone who had already, in all the ways that matter emotionally, stepped out of it. And you were doing it with a level of care that actually deserves to be met, not drained. So the question becomes, what do you do with this awareness? The first shift is this: you stop shrinking yourself. Because one of the most damaging effects of this dynamic is not just the distance from the other person, but the way it slowly reshapes you. You start filtering everything. You start measuring your words. You start anticipating reactions. You stop bringing up your needs. You stop expressing discomfort. You begin adjusting yourself around their emotional limits instead of your own truth. And over time, you don't just lose the relationship. You lose your own internal space inside it. What remains is a kind of emotional self-monitoring that feels like survival, not love. And that difference matters. The second shift is that you stop trying to extract meaning from fragments. In these dynamics, it's very easy to overvalue small moments. A slightly warmer exchange, a nostalgic interaction, a brief return of familiarity. The mind clings to these moments because it's trying to stabilize uncertainty. It turns them into signs, into hope, into evidence that things are turning around. But when those moments don't lead to sustained change, they become part of a cycle that keeps you emotionally invested in something that isn't actually progressing. So instead of interpreting isolated moments, you start looking at patterns. Because patterns tell the truth that moments often hide. And the third shift is the hardest one. You allow yourself to see clearly even when clarity hurts. Because clarity is what breaks the loop. Not avoidance, not hope, not reinterpretation, but actually seeing what is consistently happening without softening it into what you wish was happening. And yes, that clarity brings grief. Grief for the version of the relationship you thought you were in. Grief for the potential you felt at the beginning. Grief for the effort you gave that didn't land where you hoped it would. But grief is not a failure state. It's a transition out of attachment. You can feel that grief and still move. You can acknowledge loss without turning it into a place you stay stuck in. Because the deeper truth is this: you cannot stabilize a connection alone. You cannot carry emotional reciprocity by yourself. And you cannot love someone into readiness if they are not willing to meet you there. Some avoidant patterns can change, but only under one condition. The person themselves chooses real, sustained, uncomfortable inner work. Not closeness from you, not more patience from you, not you adjusting yourself, trying harder, or staying longer in uncertainty. Change only happens when they take responsibility for their own emotional patterns and actively work on them over time. That distinction matters because a lot of people stay stuck thinking, if I just do this differently, he'll come back to how he was. But proximity doesn't heal avoidance. Pressure doesn't heal avoidance. And consistent effort from the other person doesn't fix someone else's internal fear of closeness. If anything, it usually intensifies the withdrawal because it triggers the very discomfort they are trying to avoid. So when you're looking at those three signs together, the disappearance of repair, the shift of his energy into a separate life, and the loss of genuine curiosity, you're not looking at confusion anymore. You're looking at emotional disinvestment. And that changes everything. Because confusion invites effort. Confusion makes you analyze, adjust, explain, and try again. But disinvestment removes the ambiguity. It means the emotional participation that once existed is no longer active in the same way. The connection is no longer being built from both sides. And without that mutual participation, you're not in a relationship dynamic anymore. You're in a maintenance dynamic where one person is holding everything together. At that point, the real decision is no longer about understanding him better or finding the right way to reach him. It becomes about you, about your stability, your emotional safety, your energy. You're faced with two paths. You can remain in uncertainty, but only if you are fully aware of what that choice actually costs you emotionally. How much energy it takes to stay in something where clarity never fully arrives, where you are constantly interpreting signals instead of receiving direct connection. Or you can begin stepping out of that pattern, not out of anger, not out of punishment, but out of recognition that a connection that requires you to shrink, overfunction, and constantly self-regulate just to maintain access to someone is no longer reciprocal. That's the key shift. It stops being about decoding them and starts being about protecting you. Because once you see the pattern clearly, the question is no longer, what is he doing? The question becomes, what is this doing to me over time? And underneath all of it is a much deeper reflection point. Not about him, but about you. What part of you learned that love has to be earned through endurance? What part of you started believing that being chosen requires you to tolerate emotional inconsistency? What made uncertainty feel familiar enough that you stayed inside it longer than you should have? That's not about blame, it's about awareness. Because patterns like this don't start with the current relationship. They get reinforced through experience over time. And that's why this realization matters. Because the real goal was never just to understand someone who pulls away. The real goal is to stop disappearing from yourself while trying to stay close to someone who isn't fully meeting you where you are.